Hello and a very warm welcome to everyone joining today's webinar titled Getting Ready for In Vitro Diagnostic Regulation. My name's Thomas Casburn and I'll be moderating today's session. So in today's webinar, I'm delighted to be joined by three leaders in the field of in vitro diagnostics who will be sharing their insight on the regulations and providing everything you need to know in order to get ready for the transition to IVDR. Kicking off today's presentation will be Sue Spencer, Head of IVD and a Principal Consultant at QServe. Sue has over 30 years of experience in the medical device and IVD industries, including extensive notified body experience. In today's webinar, Sue will be explaining the importance of intended purpose and how to prepare the relevant documentation. Our second speaker is Eric Vollebrechter. Eric is a founding partner of the life sciences niche firm Axon Lawyers in Amsterdam. He has more than 20 years of legal and regulatory experience in EU and Dutch national life sciences regulation. In his talk, Eric will be covering the responsibilities of manufacturers under various scenarios and how broader marketing claims impact certification and liability. Our final speaker will be Dr. Julian Senak, the Global Director of the IVD Focus Team at TUSAD. Dr. Senak has more than 10 years of experience in biomedical research, including with a certification body where he participated with the preparation of IVDR designation. Today, he'll be delivering a short presentation covering the notified body application process. Following the presentation, we'll be moving on to our question and answer session. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to submit them at any time during the webinar. And you can do this by clicking on the purple tab on the left of your screen and then typing in your question. Without further delay, I'd like to hand over to Sue to begin today's presentation.
Hi, my name's Sue Spencer and I'm going to be talking to you today about the importance of the intended purpose. Now, if you listen to any of the speakers you're going to hear today, you will hear us talk a lot about intended purpose. But why is it so important? Well, I'm going to start by taking a little bit of a step back, and I'm actually going to look at what the definition of an IVD is. Now, you may think this is obvious. Of course I have an IVD. But what a lot of people are missing is the fact that the technical file in requirements in Annex 2 actually require that you define why it is an IVD. And so also, if you're coming to this for the first time, you may be asking yourself that question, do the IVDR regulations apply to me or not? So whether you're new or whether you have an existing device, this is an exercise you're going to have to go through. So what I've done is I've highlighted some important features of the definition that you will need to consider and document in your technical file. So an IVD is a medical device, so there has to be a medical intended purpose. And that is if it's a reagent product, calibrator, control, material, kit, instrument, apparatus, piece of equipment, or software or system, and whether it's used alone or in combination. And it has to be that it is intended by you, the manufacturer. Now, I'm going to come back and talk about that in more detail in a minute. It also has to be in vitro for the examination of specimens. So again, another important test, do I have an IVD, is there a specimen? And that could be blood or tissue donations, but it could be feces, hair, sweat, saliva. As long as it is a sample that can be taken away from the body, even if it's a prick of blood that sits on the finger, that's still a specimen. And it has to be solely or principally for providing information. And then there's a series of bullet points here which you have to consider, whether you're providing information for a physiological or pathological state, whether it's for congenital or mental impairments, whether it's for the predisposition to a medical condition or disease, whether it's for the safety and compatibility of potential recipients, whether it predicts treatment or response or reactions, or whether it's for monitoring for therapeutic measures. And we shouldn't forget the specimen receptacles are also included as an IVD. So if you don't think that that your product meets that definition, then you may have a research use only product. It could be a product for this general laboratory use. Or if it's actually invasive in a body orifice, like a swab, for example, then it may not be an IVD at all. It might actually be a medical device. And that's why it's really important that we define to start with if we have an IVD. So, intended purpose. If we actually look at the definition of intended purpose, it says that this is where a device is intended according to the data supplied by the manufacturer on the label, in the instructions for use, or in promotional or sales materials or statements as specified by the manufacturer in the performance evaluation. So to a certain extent, this sounds, I have an intended use statement. That must be my intended purpose statement. I have it covered. I already have one of those. However, you need to look at Annex 2, 1.1c, and also the general safety and performance requirements in 20 rather. And this has much more prescriptive requirements, and this is where we find the majority of problems start. So you have to define what you're actually detecting or measuring and what's the intended function. And you have to specifically state, is it for screening, monitoring, diagnosis, aid to diagnosis, prognosis, prediction, or is it a companion diagnostic? And that's often where we find the analyte is stated, but it doesn't clearly state what the function is. It's just, this is a useful analyte for measuring, but not for what. And you also then have to say what the specific disorder or condition or risk factor is, and whether it's intended to detect, define, or differentiate. And again, that's often missing. You also have to define whether it's automated, whether it's qualitative, semi-quantitative, or quantitative, and who your intended user is. Particularly important because there's much more requirements about near-patient testing. So is it intended to be used in a doctor's office, or an ambulance, or even an air ambulance, because the requirements will be quite different. And then you have to say who your intended population is, and also what specimen type you intend your product to be used for. And ultimately, you're going to need data to support all of these that you describe as part of your intended purpose. Now, the definition of intended purpose already started to broaden it than what you actually put in your intended purpose statement. So you can't mislead people either. And Article 7 talks about claims. So it could be promotional material. It could be those handy application notes that you provide to your customers. But it's also often how you place the product on the market. So you could put in your intended purpose statement, this is for professional use. But actually, I now provide it over the internet, or I sell it through Amazon or eBay or one of those other platforms. And at that point, I'm now providing it directly to patients, and I've just made it into a self-test. So it doesn't matter how strong the claim is in your intended purpose that says this is for professional use. I've actually changed my intended purpose by the way that I sell it, in jargon terms, how I put it on the market. And you can't mislead even if it's the diagrams that you put in your instructions for use or on your website, for example. So you have to be very careful. So why is this all important? How does it connect to my technical documentation? Well, the clinical evidence, which you'll find as part of your performance evaluation, I always think about it having 3 pillars, and I like to represent it by this little Grecian temple. The reason for that is if you don't have all 3 pillars of clinical evidence, then you don't have a solid performance evaluation. So the first of these is scientific validity. So scientific validity associates the analyte you're trying to measure to your clinical condition or physiological state, whereas the analytical performance means the ability of your device to correctly detect or measure a particular analyte. So here we might be looking at analytical sensitivity and specificity, for example, whereas our clinical performance means that the ability of the device to yield results that correlate with a particular clinical condition or a physiological or pathological state in accordance with the intended population and the intended user. So this could be our clinical diagnostic sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, that sort of thing. So how does this all fit together? And if you may have noticed, I color-coded those definitions, and I've done it again on this slide, and I will in the next slide as well. So our intended purpose is one of the main feeds into our performance evaluation plan. And it doesn't matter whether you have a legacy product or you're developing a product from scratch, you need a performance evaluation plan, because that's going to describe where you're going to get all the information from to support your intended purpose. And by the way, intended purpose and intended use mean the same thing. So the performance evaluation plan, if you have a legacy device, will be describing where information you already have, maybe from a 510K, maybe from a PMA, maybe from your existing IVD directive technical file, where it's all going to come from. And then you need to prepare a scientific validity report, an analytical performance report, and a clinical performance report. Now, the issue here is if you make a mistake in your intended purpose, you will have a hole in your performance evaluation plan, and then each of the supporting reports. Ultimately, these are all going to be drawn together into a performance evaluation report, so that will also be incorrect. And also your post-market performance follow-up plan will also be incorrect. So your technical file will start to look like Swiss cheese. You will have holes throughout the technical documentation. And this is one of the things that we've seen where we've been presented with files to review. The intended purpose was incorrect. And so therefore the whole of the technical file had holes in it. And therefore you have to go back and remediate the whole technical file. So it's really, really important that you get that intended purpose right from the very beginning. So how does that relate through? So we have our scientific validity, and that is hardwired, and the notified body will be looking back when they look at the scientific validity against what you said you were going to detect or measure, and what you said as your specific disorder, condition, or risk factor in your intended purpose. That's why I've color-coded these as orange. If we look at our analytical performance, that is stated in your intended purpose, in the analytical performance report, they're going to look at the performance for screening, monitoring, diagnosis, because the performance that you need for a diagnostic assay may be very different from the performance you need for a monitoring assay or a screening assay, for example. So they are going to compare what you've written in your analytical performance back against what you've written in your intended purpose. They will also look at whether it's automated and whether it's qualitative or semi-quantitative or quantitative. And there are specific requirements in the analytical performance for specimens, particular specimen stability, for example. And then if we look back finally at the clinical performance, the definition of clinical performance required that you have to test against the population that you've defined, and also the intended user that you defined. So again, what you've written in your intended purpose hardwires through to what you would expect to see in your clinical performance. So this is initially very much a brief overview. And if you're new to the IVD regulation, you may be thinking, gosh, there's a lot of information needed, and there's a lot of additional reports that I didn't have to put together as part of my IVD directive technical file. And you would be right. There's a lot of extra information and detail that's required. So yes, implementing the IVDR is going to be a bit of a bumpy ride, but if you're starting out on that journey, the most important thing is that you get that intended purpose right from the beginning, so that you create a suitable technical file. And then following that, the next most important thing to do is to make sure that you understand all the requirements of these new reports moving forwards. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll look forward to questions at the end of the session.
This is Eric Vollebrecht speaking to you on this LGC webinar about the IVDR, specifically about responsibilities of the manufacturer under the IVDR. There are a number of responsibilities of the manufacturer under the IVDR. Let's see, yes, this is working correctly. Because, well, basically you could say the manufacturer is the ring to bind them all. Under the IVDR, the manufacturer has all the obligations. In that sense, this is not very new compared to the MDR, except that there's a difference that, the IVD directive. A difference with the IVD regulation is that it is much clearer about what happens when somebody else is actually playing manufacturer, or under what circumstances somebody else than the manufacturer starts doing things that might be seen as manufacturing activity. Like, for example, relabeling a product, repackaging a product, things like that. So again, the responsibility is on the manufacturer that the devices are compliant, that they are designed, manufactured in accordance with the requirements of the IVDR. But what happens if you don't make the product? So basically, you do something else with the product than manufacturing it. And how do broader marketing claims impact my certification and liability? Well, these are all things that the IVDR deals with. If you don't make the product, then there is a specific rule in Article 16 of the IVDR that says any third party becomes a manufacturer if he does any of the following three things mentioned in Article 16(1). So, for example, if you make a device on the market under your own name, trademark, or registered trademark. Because remember, the in vitro diagnostics directive, but also the IVDR defines a manufacturer as the party that places a device on the market under his own name or trademark. So if you do that, so if you rebrand a device that's already on the market, then you become manufacturer for the purposes of the IVDR, except, says Article 16(1)(a), and in that regard it is new compared to the existing IVD directive, except where the person that brands the device with his own name or trademark has an agreement with the manufacturer that the manufacturer remains responsible for regulatory obligations and is mentioned as such on the label. So, for example, is indicated as manufacturer with the manufacturer factory sign, the ISO sign. So that's one way in which you can become a manufacturer under the IVDR. Another one, and this was a ground that already existed under the IVD directive, but which was less clearly explained, if you change the intended purpose of a device already placed on the market or put into service. So let's say, for example, you have a COVID-19 test that is indicated for testing a specific mutation of the virus, but you are changing the intended purpose by marketing it also for, let's say, now the British and the South African and perhaps the Brazilian variant of the virus. That is changing the intended purpose. In that case, you become a manufacturer of the device, even if it's been placed on the market already, meaning you are responsible for CE marking the device for the new intended purpose. And if you don't, then you are placing a incorrectly CE marked device on the market, which can be enforced against. Then there is another ground that can make you a legal manufacturer. This was the case under the IVD directive already. if you modify a device already placed on the market or put into service in such a way that compliance with the applicable requirements might be affected. So, for example, and this is something that was subject to quite a lot of controversy, relabeling and translation of IFUs. It was the Servoprax judgment at the European Court of Justice, where the European Court of Justice said, well, relabeling and translation of instructions for use is not really modification of the device, so you don't need a quality system for that, and you don't become a manufacturer either. But under the IVDR, also the IVDR says, well, this is not something that makes you a manufacturer, but you have to do repackaging or translation in accordance with specific IVDR procedures that are set out, which actually do require you to have a quality management system that is certified by a notified body. There is MDCG guidance coming from that for that, and you need to notify the authorities and the manufacturer. All other device modifications are done in a way that compliance with the requirements is effective, do constitute a situation in which you become a legal manufacturer. Another typical situation how you could actually become a manufacturer of a medical device. This is one example that a notified body recently told me that they see this quite a lot, where somebody adds a non-CE marked medical device to a kit when the kit is not CE marked as a device in itself. So, for example, let's say you buy swabs in a kit. You buy them bulk from an OEM in China, and they are not CE marked for the EU market, but you still put it in a kit. Then basically you become legal manufacturer of or you have to be legal manufacturer of the swab, because in order to place it on the market in the EU, it has to be CE marked as a medical device. So this is also one way under the IVDR that you can actually become legal manufacturer of a medical device. The solution would be to CE mark either the swab separately or the whole CE mark as a device in itself, because then you can also take the swab on board. Claims, that's how does it work with claims basically? The other question, how do broader marketing claims impact my certification? Well, there's a new article under the IVDR that specifies something which we already knew under the IVD directive, and that is, if you claim outside the scope of your intended purpose, then this will affect, of course, your certification. Now, the IVDR contains a much more specific clause in this regard, which I've copied over here. So basically, it says that in any related documentation regarding the device, but also marketing practices regarding the device, it says advertising of devices, you can't use any text, names, trademark, pictures, and so on that may mislead the user or the patient. So the user and the patient may be different things, different people actually, with regard to the device's intended purpose, safety, and performance by doing any of these four things. So ascribing functions or properties to the product which the product doesn't have, like for example, claiming a higher level of certainty, or maybe implying functionality that the product doesn't have. Creating a false impression regarding treatment or diagnosis, functions or property which a product doesn't have. So, for example, typically outcome claims that are not supported by the performance evaluation would be in scope here. Failing to inform of a likely risk associated with the use of the product in line with its intended purpose, very important. This basically is one that is especially important with self-testing IVDs. Like, for example, likely risk associated with the product is that the risk of a false positive for, I don't know, let's say a pregnancy test, for example. And then the last one is suggesting uses of the product other than those declared in the intended purpose when the conformity assessment was carried out. So, for example, this is typically off-label promotion. And all of these things are prohibited, which means that they are subject to enforcement by competent authorities on a national level. It's important that, and I have paraphrased CE here as connected everything, this Article 7 shows how incredibly linked all the documents in the technical documentation are, because these claims for the product feature in all kinds of different sets of documentation all over the place. So it means that you have to be a lot more careful as a manufacturer with consistencies throughout all of your documents, which I have shown in this graph. This is a graph that actually it's not specifically about the IVDR. This is one for the MDR, but the MDR has also the same Article 7 in it. And it just shows how all these processes are related with regards to claims. And the message here is that because everything is connected in terms of shared content, everything must be consistent to avoid issues under Article 7. So this was a very quick and fast introduction in claims under the IVDR and what if I don't make the product, can I still be manufacturer questions under the IVDR. So, thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Julian Sunak. I am the Global Focus Team Director at TÜV, and we basically today will talk about the notify body application process that you would have to go through in the view of the IVDR. So as a manufacturer, you have a journey to see certification that always will start with a pre-application. This is a new requirement of the regulation, and we'll explain to you what the purpose of that pre-application. We will then move to the real full-on application process. And then finally, when you have approved that process, the rest that you're aware of it is the TD assessment, the QMS audit for your company. And then finally, the notified body would do the review, the approval up fully, and then the certification. And if you have completed all of these steps, this is the point where you could apply the CE marking with the identification number of your favorite notified body, in our case, TÜV 0123. So let's go back to the really first step, which is the pre-application step. Why do we have this pre-application step? And the reason it's simple is that one of the requirements of the regulation, which allow also the manufacturer to evaluate the most suitable notified body for their portfolio. It also allows the notified body to provide non-binding quotes, which kind of a way for you to shop around, but for us also to showcase what we could do for you. And in that moment, this is free of binding, right? As a manufacturer, you are free to go around, ask questions, and see what can work the best. And the application process we'll see is more binding and have more rules around it. So during this pre-application phase, we will collect a set of information. A simple one is who you are, so like just your legal entity, your name. And then we'll set some other element, and that in the purpose of being able to present you with a quote that will be reflective to the amount of work we have to do. So we need to have information around your QMS, which means your addresses of the different sites that you have covered. So if you have a single site, it's easy, but if you have multiple sites, for each site we'll have to have the address, the main contact. This is more for us to start the recording of this information, the number of employees, the shift, because if you have multiple shifts, that can affect the duration of the audit, and also all the products that are manufactured in those sites, because some sites could manufacture a handful of products or all of them, it depends. So we need to know to which extent the production is done there. Then we have to look at all the processes and sub-items per locations, because you could have multiple locations, and in those different kind of activities. Some of them may be dedicated to purchasing, some of them dedicated to production. So it's very important that for each location, you tell us what are the activities that are performed there. That also allows us to see how much time for each location we need to spend in order to answer the requirement for the QMS. The next set of elements we need to know is which route maybe you're looking for. At that point, if you don't know, that's not the most changing in our quote, but it's important to have it. Then you have the details on the suppliers and subcontractors, because if you do a lot of subcontracting of critical processes that can influence, as I said, the conformity of the product. So it's really important to look at the conformity of the product when you think of subcontractor and suppliers. What does that affect? And you need to give us the name, the address, the product that they are involved with, their QMS certificate, usually they have one, and the control in place by the manufacturer. And the last step we need to have is the detail on your product. The type of product, the class, the rule that apply. Is it the self-test and your patient test? What are the IVP code and IVDR code? And this is usually to be able to see if we can do the sampling, in which order we have to do the sampling, and as well as your intended purpose. And finally, your readiness. That allows us to also see if we can serve you. When we get this information, we'll basically switch to the application phase. In that application phase, this is when we will have in between issue a non-binding quote that you will have agreed with the non-binding quote, and now you can formulate your formal application with the notified body and have a written contract between the notified body and the manufacturer. So it's very important this stage that you don't take it lightly, because when an application is started, if you withdraw your application for any reason, we as notified body have to inform the competent authorities as well as notified body that you have withdrawn your application for such and such products. There is a set of elements that you have to provide, and they are key to provide during the application as well, they are listed here. Among them, you have the draft of the EU Declaration of Conformity. You have some documentation on your quality management system, on the description of the procedures, description of the manufacturer post-market surveillance, right? What you have in place, what you're planning to put in place. You have to have documentation on your performance evaluation plan. So not that maybe you have done, but at least having the plan. And you have all the procedures that you want to keep your performance evaluation plan up to date and within the state of the art. So the backbone of your QMS has to be provided if we follow the Annex 9, right? This is kind of taking directly out of the regulation, but these are the different places we need to have. So it's really how your QMS would work. If you do an Annex 9, we also have to have any other elements that are related to the kind of class of product we will review. So if you have for class B and the C and the Ds, including the CDX, we will have to have a description of the design, the manufacture, and the performance of the device in questions, and the technical documentation as referred to the Annex 2 and 3. It seems to be very long to put in the annex, but again, this is taken out of the regulation. As the regulation wants you that when you launch the application for it, you're ready to submit. I have to say that, you know, we need to all prepare in advance. So if you do not have them exactly ready, we would have agreed on when you have to provide this information at the time of the application, because you may want to start your application. We will agree upon what we're doing, and within the application, we will also agree on the date of the submission. That will be the beginning of the work that we do for you. For the class B, the C, and the D for self-test and near patient, we have an extra set of information in addition to the technical documentation, which is the test report, including the result of studies that are carried out. You have example of the device, if possible, the data showing the suitability of the device for its intended purpose, which is ready for near patient testing. So, which means that and self-test. So, if you say it to be used in a helicopter, we need to have data that you gathered within a helicopter or emergency helicopter, and that's kind of what we mean by this suitable for intended purpose. And then you have to also provide the device, the information provided in the label and instruction for use. This is, I think, reinforce what you need to do, because technically you should have it in the technical documentation. What do we have in the technical documentation is maybe the pointers and so on, at least at the beginning, and then we'll ask you to send the rest of the documents when we start the review. If we decide to go to a different annex, which is the Annex 10 and 11, the content you have to give for the technical documentation review, which is linked to Annex 10, will be pretty much the same. The only thing is that you also have to provide a representative sample of the device that represent the finished product, and this basically needs to be made available. So I'm not saying you have to send it right over, you need to make this available when needed. And then you have also for self-testing in your patients, it's the same kind of idea as we discussed previously. Lastly, this goes with Annex 11, and Annex 11 asks for the same element that I discussed above for Annex 9, but they add one more level of complexity, which is to provide the technical documentation for annexes according to Annexes 2 and 3. And why we do that here is because you could get the Annex 11 with a notified body and the Annex 10 with another, as you can see here. So if you did not use the same notified body, here there is an extra step of information that you have to give. And that's really what happened at the application. It's really linked to the phase of the TD evaluation later. So at that point, I will stop and I will take any question that you may have on this section. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue, Eric, and Julian for those informative presentations. It's now time for our question and answer session. So if you have any questions for our speakers, please do continue to send them in, and you can do that using the purple tab on the left of your screen. So we've had lots of questions come in already, and we'll endeavour to answer all of them in this session. And the first one here is for Sue, and that's, my product has been on the market for 10 years. Do I really need a performance evaluation plan?
I'm sure Julianne and I have probably, if we had £1 for every time we've been asked this question, and the answer is yes. It is a requirement in the regulation, it says shall, but also think of it, the idea of the plan is where you set out the specifications your product is to achieve and where you look what data you have to support that. Now, if it's an existing device, you're actually maybe looking back at other data you have from other sources and saying that that's what you're going to use. And if there are any gaps, then maybe you need to do a study. But that's what you describe in your performance evaluation plan. So it is a little bit like a V&V plan that you might have for FDA, but it is a requirement, and yes, you do need one.
Perfect, thank you for that. And for Julian, I suppose, can I use data from a 510K?
Well, yes, I will give you the notified body answer. It depends. But the idea is, yes, you can use some of that data, but don't just think that because it was 510K approved, it will be enough, or it could be enough, but you may have to have new ones. Very important for you to look at what you have as a data and have the statistic to really support your claim. In addition, I would say that be sure that depending on what it is we're looking for, especially maybe on genetics, where SNPs and so on can be different depending on which area in the globe you have the data. You need to have still something representative to the European population. So on case by case, that might not be sufficient data.
Perfect, thank you for that. Our next question is for Eric, and this is: my company develops infectious disease assays, which we provide on a platform that is made by a third party, but marketed under our own name. We understand we are responsible for compliance, but they won't share their technical file. How can we CE mark under IVDR?
Well, that depends. Actually, it depends on how you want to market the product. There are several ways. If you can, for example, you could be a virtual manufacturer. In that case, that would be difficult if you don't have access to the technical file of the supplier, because you will need to build your own technical file. So that wouldn't work. Then another option is that's basically, if you don't have access to the technical file, would be to become a so-called branded distributor, where you would be in a situation that you brand the product with your own name, but the supplier is still labeled on the product as the legal manufacturer. In that case, you don't need your own technical documentation, but you can market it under your own name. And there's a specific clause in the IVDR that provides for that, Article 16, Section 1, Sub A, as explained in the presentation.
Excellent, thank you. And a follow-up for you, Eric, actually. If you have multiple distributors in Europe, who is the importer?
That depends, because the importer is defined as the first party placing the product on the market in the EU. So basically, it would be the first distributor that imports the product, that places the product on the market. And if you have several distributors that are each supplied from outside of the EU, theoretically, each of those distributors can be importer. So if you have a very vertical supply chain, it's the first distributor in Europe. And if you supply distributors directly, then every directly supplied distributor can be an importer.
Excellent, thank you very much. I have a question for Julian here. I am developing a Class C product to be launched in May 2020, or May 22nd, sorry, but my studies will not be completed until October 2021. Will I still be able to get notified body approval if I apply at the end of 2021?
So the question, would you get an approval? Yes, you may get an approval. Now, would you have an approval by May 2022? That could be depending on different things. I would say that if you have major issue in your technical documentation require time, then you will need a lot more than 6 months. Also, when we look at Class C, if it's a general Class C, it could be different. If it's a CDX, for example, we need to have like a consultation with the EMA, and that may take up to 120 days. In that case, it's self-answer. It's already 4 months in or so. So you might be very tight to get everything in May, knowing that you have to have the technical documentation complete, the audit complete, as well as the review by notified body and all the answers to CAPAs. At that point, I would say that if you try to aim for the end of November 2021, that would be a safe bet, because it gives us about 6 months before May, and it seems to be safe to have answered most of the issues.
Fantastic, thank you. So our next question here is, I believe for Sue, but if Eric or Julian, if you can add, please do. And this is regarding performance evaluation. And the question is, should we conduct performance evaluation on the prototype batch or the manufacturing batch?
Okay, so your performance evaluation data should be representative of what you're expecting to see on market. So it needs to be conducted to product that's been made in manufacturing conditions under SOPs. It doesn't mean it has to be to full scale. So if you made it to a smaller batch size, then obviously as you scale up in the future, you need to validate that scale up to show that it continues to be representative. But that's the key driver here. It has to be, the data you're producing has to be representative of final product. So yeah, unfortunately, it does have to be on SOPs, and it should be in the manufacturing environment as well.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that clarification. Our next question is, how do you demonstrate the scientific validity of an IVD instrument that is not intended for any specific analytes, for example, a thermocycler or a mass spectrometer?
The definition of scientific validity is you're looking at how the analyte compares to the clinical condition. So there may be some circumstances for things like wash buffers and also for, in other words, accessories and also instruments where there isn't actually an analyte and there isn't a clinical condition. So that's what you would be discussing. Particularly if you have an analyzer, for example, that may be using multiple analytes, then really that's actually addressed as part of the technical file for the analyte. So generally, if you ask anybody, is scientific validity required? The answer is yes, unless duly justified, and there may be some of those less frequent situations where actually it may not be applicable, but the notified body can't assume that. You have to tell them and explain exactly why, and it has to be a really valid reason like that, for example. I don't know, Julianne, whether you want to comment.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would be on the same page on that one. Which, scientific validity is a requirement. So somehow, if it cannot be fulfilled for this specific reason, and I would say don't try to justify not to have one for a reagent, that would probably will never go through. But for an instrument, you could justify that there's not one specific. What I would also do. An instrument in that case, probably in that case, I guess we have to see over details, might also be a class A. So you could, first of all, the notified body may not look at it at all, but if for your interest as being compliant, you may want to refer to scientific validity of the other analytes in your technical documentation, so you have a traceability of what your device could be used for or with.
I mean, we also have to be careful that not all instruments are equal. So there are things like blood gas, for example, which, because there's no reagents, is classified as a class C. So you could potentially argue that scientific validity isn't applicable, but whether you call it scientific validity or whether you have to describe it basically the same thing as part of your performance evaluation plan and report, you're still having to explain why blood gas is compared to the clinical conditions that you're putting in your intended purpose. So in that case, it may be actually, even though strictly speaking, it's not an analyte in a clinical condition, it is clinical condition, you probably still want to put a scientific validity together. So it's really those low risk instruments, the multi-use instruments, and things like wash buffers and that sort of thing that would fall into this group, I think.
Yeah, I think the class A would basically be the one we try to justify. Any other class, I would doubt it.
Okay, thank you very much, both of you. Okay, our next question, I think we'll get Eric involved for this one. For general use IVD devices, where do you draw the line with marketing materials with regard to mentioning specific analytical targets?
Well, you draw, as Sue has explained, you draw it by what the intended purpose supports. And that's the whole idea of Article 7. As soon as you go outside the intended purpose, then you are in a very tricky territory. And the intended purpose needs to be reflected in all these in all the documents that mention the intended purpose, and marketing is actually one of them, which is often very hard for the marketing department to understand that actually marketing materials under the IVDR are basically they're basically the public part of your technical documentation, and that's also how I would advise to treat them.
And another good top tip there, Eric, is make sure you train your marketing department.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and it's important because I mean that's of course my lawyer perspective is that it happens so often that competitors ask me, hey, look at this marketing materials, see this is their declaration of conformity, what can we do? And then you see these marketing claims that really wildly diverge from the declaration of conformity supported intended purpose, and then you make yourself one big target for a competitor to stick an enormous stick in the wheel of your marketing campaign. So it's just it's a pity then.
And also don't forget YouTube, because again, a number of times I've had people sort of say, "Oh yes, I think it's a Class B device," and as soon as you start to click on the YouTube links, it's cancer, or we use this in the emergency department, and it's like, whoa, hang on a minute.
Yeah, and even fact sheets that you give to your marketing people that visit customers, for example. These are also, even if, let's say, that's something I see happen a lot as well, where you have a discussion between a customer and a sales rep, and the customer sends back an email saying, okay, so I understand correctly that you told me that the device can do this and this and this. I mean, then basically you can already fall foul of Article 7, because basically it's a record of the sales conversation.
Perfect. Some fantastic advice from all three of you there. Our next question is referring to Eric's presentation, to point A on a slide. If we were to choose to private label an IVD instrument, it appears we would have two options. First, we could private label and then have an agreement with the OEM that they will meet and hold all IVDR requirements, which would free us from that responsibility. Or we could private label, and then if the manufacturer does not want to maintain responsibility, they would have to share their documents and data with us in order to meet IVDR requirements. Is this the correct line of thinking?
Yes, it is, because these are basically the only two tastes, you could say, that are on the menu of the IVDR. I mean, there's also the possibility that you buy a technical file basically from an OEM that already has a technical file but is not going to place it on the market themselves, and they will just produce the device to your specifications and you would be manufacturer, but that's normally not how it goes in private labeling scenarios. So for private labeling as we knew it, then it's either virtual manufacturing with access to the technical documentation of the other manufacturer, or it is Article 16(1)(a). Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. And I think it's on the same slide. Regarding point B, is the change of intended purpose of a device also applicable when, as a manufacturer, change only the product's original protocol to match my assay? Are you on mute, Eric?
Oh, sorry, was that a question to me? Oh, my apologies.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Can you repeat it, please?
Yes, so is the change of intended purpose of a device also applicable when, as a manufacturer, changes only the product's original protocol to match my assay?
Well, that would be a question that you would need to discuss with the notified body, probably, but it depends on how the intended purpose is phrased. If you match it to a very specific assay and then you change things there, then that's a change of intended purpose. So it's hard to answer the question without knowing the exact intended purpose.
Yeah, I mean, I will concur on that. It really depends what you mean by changing the protocol. Is it also changing what you're looking for, or is it like, maybe a volume difference or something like that? So
Yeah.
you have to, it will have to be something that we need to check more in depth, depending on from where to where we're going in such question.
Okay, thank you both for that. Our next question is, can we think intended purpose is similar to intended use as FDA?
I would say if you were developing a new product today and you were going to sell in Europe and the US, that the more prescriptive today is Europe. However, I would say that they're probably mutually compatible now. But the other discussion that you often hear is, is intended purpose and intended use the same? I think the general consensus is that yes, they do mean the same, even though people will switch between the two. One tends to be more of a US term. Intended purpose is the official European term. One of the problems we have in the IVD side, though, is a lot of products are perhaps quite old products. They've been on the market for some time. They were actually put together for the intended use perhaps 10 years ago with FDA, and that wasn't as prescriptive. So all these bullet points that I was kind of stressing how important they were, you won't find those in those intended use statements. So yes, you should be able to use an up-to-date FDA intended use statement. However, it needs to meet every single bullet point in the IVDR.
Yeah,
perfect.
That's what I think that's the same point. You have to be careful. And some people will say intended purpose, intended use have a slight difference where, for example, my purpose is to detect cancer and my use is really somewhere maybe in a point of care instead of a laboratory environment. But at the end of the day, all these bullet points are within the intended purpose of the IVDR. So even if they look at the same, you still have to refer to be sure that you check all boxes of what is needed for Europe. Otherwise, notified body will come back at you with questions.
Okay, thank you very much, both. So we have time for just a few more questions today. This one for Eric. Do you expect Article 7 of the IVDR to lead to an American-style language in advertising, disclaimers, etc., or can you simply rely on the please consult IFU for more details?
I think neither. I'm a bit optimistic in that regard because what Article 7 does is causes manufacturers to be very and others, marketing actually, so importers and distributors as well, to be very specific and mindful about what the intended purpose of the device is. And what I often see in US style advertising is that there are a lot of disclaimers. Like I sometimes even see documents that basically say, well, you can't use this IVD for anything basically, even though it's marketed for a specific intended purpose. So that definitely would not fly under Article 7. And on the other hand, the statement refer to the instructions for use. You can do that, but still Article 7 is also really about misleading. So that also means that you have to be specific enough in the marketing statement itself to not mislead a user about what the intended purpose is. So that brings you to a situation where you can't make, let's say, a cheeky broad claim and then refer to the instructions for use for further qualifications. So what I think the end result will be is that we will get hopefully get more precise advertising that contains more relevant information. And that again brings me back to what Sue just said. that requires training on the part of the marketing department, because they are very much trained or schooled or geared towards making statements that are promotional rather than informative. And I think that's also a good frame to put this in, the change to the IVDRs, that your marketing needs to become more informative and less promotional.
Okay, thank you ever so much. So I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. So thank you to each of you for your excellent presentations and your discussions just now. And thank you to everyone joining us online and for sending in your questions.